I sat by the window in my downtown apartment, the city lights glinting off the glass like tiny fragments of memory I couldn't quite place. My silk blouse felt impossibly smooth against my skin, a sharp contrast to the flutter in my stomach that never seemed to leave me during the holidays. My phone buzzed on the marble counter, breaking the quiet hum of the evening. I glanced at it, my brother's name flashing on the screen. The memory hit me before I could think. That Christmas dinner, the long wooden table, the warm smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon. I had been 17, and he had smirked across the table, the cruel edge in his voice cutting sharper than the carving knife. "Your plate's with the dogs." Laughter had erupted around him, and I had stayed frozen, my hands clutching my napkin, my heart pounding like it would betray me. Dad's eyes hadn't met mine that night. He had said nothing, but later, much later, I found out he had quietly made arrangements for me that would change everything. My pulse quickened at the thought. I had built my life in quiet defiance, every achievement a silent answer to that smirk, every late-night struggle a whisper to myself that I could rise, even without anyone's approval. Now, looking at the city from my balcony, I felt the weight of that memory, but also the thrill of control. The message from him flickered on the screen again, teasing me with a confrontation I hadn't expected, but maybe had been waiting for my whole life. Christmas lights twinkled through the frosted windows of our family home, but the warmth inside never reached me. I remember sitting at the long dining table, my hands pressed into my lap, so tightly my nails dug into my palms. I had been 17, full of hope that night, imagining a holiday where I belonged. But the second my brother leaned back, a smug grin tugging at his lips, I realized hope wasn't on the menu. "Your plate's with the dogs," he said, voice dripping with amusement. The words echoed like a hammer in my chest. The laughter around him was sharp, cutting, the kind that wraps itself around shame and doesn't let go. My stomach lurched, my hands trembled, and for a moment, I thought I might disappear entirely. Dad didn't say a word, his fork suspended midair, eyes sliding past me as if I weren't there. I stared at the far end of the table, trying to make myself small enough to vanish. My grandmother, sensing the storm, had slipped a folded napkin into my hand. Inside was a tiny charm, a silver key, worn from years of handling, and a note in her delicate script. "One day, you'll open doors they didn't even know existed. Keep this, and never let anyone tell you where you belong." Her eyes met mine, warm but firm, telling me I wasn't invisible, even if they thought I was. That night, I slipped out after the dishes were cleared, the key cold in my palm, the memory of his smirk burning in my mind. I wandered down snow-covered streets, the crisp winter air stinging my cheeks, and for the first time, I made a decision. I wouldn't wait for recognition or permission. I wouldn't let their judgments define me. Every insult, every dismissal, every plate with the dogs would become fuel. I would create my own table, my own life, my own worth. By the time I returned home, the seed of independence had taken root. I carried that silver key everywhere, not as a symbol of confinement, but of possibility. Proof that even when the world chose to belittle me, there was a path forward. That night, the girl who had once trembled under the weight of laughter and smirks became determined. She didn't know how she'd rise, only that she would. The silver key from my grandmother became more than a keepsake. It was a talisman, a quiet reminder that doors existed beyond the ones slammed in my face. I started small, teaching myself skills no one thought I could master. I remember late nights in a cramped studio apartment, the hum of my laptop filling the silence, coffee cooling on the windowsill, and doubt gnawing at me like a persistent shadow. Every click, every typed line, every rejected proposal was a test, and some nights I failed miserably. It wasn't long before I met Eleanor, a seasoned woman in the finance world who saw potential rather than mistakes. She had sharp eyes and a laugh that could cut tension in half. "You don't need them to believe in you," she said the first time we met. "You need to believe in yourself. Everything else is noise." I hung onto her words like a lifeline, following her guidance as I navigated contracts, clients, and the subtle, unspoken rules of the business world. Progress was slow at first. The first client I secured barely covered my rent, and the nights of celebration were solitary, an echo of my past, reminding me of the isolation I had learned to embrace. I remember the first project that truly succeeded, my hands shaking as I hit send on a proposal I had agonized over for days. When the approval came, I didn't rush to tell anyone. I just smiled to myself, allowing the quiet triumph to settle in my chest like a warm glow. Every small win built momentum. My network expanded, and opportunities arrived in whispers rather than fanfare. I learned to code, negotiate, and lead, often in rooms where I was the only woman under 30. Each success was private, carefully curated, not to boast, but to shield myself from the echoes of old family doubts. Social media updates were vague, professional, unremarkable, so no one would suspect the scale of my achievements. By the time I hit my mid-20s, I had financial independence, a portfolio of successful ventures, and a reputation among colleagues who valued competence over legacy. I had built a world where I was in control, a world my family couldn't touch, and a life that reflected the promise of that silver key. Every late night, every setback, every whispered word of encouragement from Eleanor or a mentor became part of the foundation. And yet, even in this cocoon of success, a quiet anticipation lingered. The memory of that Christmas dinner and my brother's smirk never truly faded. It became a secret motivator, a reminder that power was sweetest when quietly amassed, and the reckoning, when it came, would be undeniable. I was ready, but I wasn't rushing. Patience was part of the plan. Growth had its own pace, and the time would come when the doors I had opened alone would swing wide, and everyone who had doubted me would finally see the woman I had become. The invitation was casual, almost innocuous, but I knew exactly what it was. My family, expecting the timid, struggling version of me, stepping into my world. I arrived at the country club that evening, the soft winter light brushing the snow-covered lawns, my heels clicking with deliberate confidence across the marble floors. The scent of pine from the holiday decorations mingled with the faint aroma of expensive leather and polished wood. I had arrived on my own terms, and for the first time in years, I felt no fear, only anticipation. They were waiting in the private dining room, chatter filling the air like static. My brother's smirk was there, of course, that same expression I had carried in my memory like a shadow, ready to pounce. Dad's expression was unreadable, and my mother's tight smile suggested curiosity, but not suspicion. I let them settle, let them take in the room, the subtle elegance, the understated luxury, the personal touches that reflected years of independent success. A crystal sculpture from a first major client sat on the sideboard. Shelves were lined with awards and framed letters of recognition. Everything spoke of accomplishment, and everything had been built quietly, deliberately alone. I took a seat at the head of the table, my hands folded neatly in my lap. For a moment, I let silence do its work, letting their eyes travel across the details they had not expected. I watched their expressions shift, eyebrows raising, mouths tightening, disbelief creeping in like frost along a windowpane. Then I let the words fall. "I know some of you expected a different me tonight," I said, voice steady but warm, carrying the cadence of someone who had earned every ounce of confidence. Someone struggling. Someone dependent. Someone small. My brother's jaw tightened, Dad's eyes widened slightly, and my mother's hand went to her chest. I let a slow smile curl across my lips. "I built this," I continued, gesturing to the room, to the awards, to the subtle luxuries that whispered of years of effort. Not because anyone handed me opportunities. Not because I was lucky. I did it because someone gave me a little belief when I had none, and I turned it into something bigger than I could have imagined. I paused, letting the words sink. "And yes," I added, looking directly at my brother, "I've done it all without the validation you thought you could withhold from me." The room was quiet, the kind of silence heavy with astonishment and guilt. My father finally spoke, voice low, almost reverent. I didn't realize, but I cut him off gently, not with anger, but with authority. It doesn't matter what anyone realized. What matters is what I made of it. I watched as their expressions shifted through disbelief, shame, and finally awe. The woman they had underestimated, dismissed, and laughed at had transformed quietly, deliberately, and now they were seeing the full scope of her power. I wasn't just successful. I was untouchable in ways that mattered most. Independent, confident, and unapologetically myself. No one said anything for a long moment. They didn't need to. The room itself, the subtle elegance, the quiet authority I exuded, spoke louder than any words. I had built my empire quietly, and now, finally, the reckoning was complete. The silence lingered after my reveal, thick and heavy, until I finally leaned back in my chair and let the weight of my gaze settle on each of them. This was my moment, and I intended to wield it with clarity, not cruelty. They had underestimated me for years, dismissed my efforts, and laughed at my struggles. But now, the power had shifted, and I would decide the terms. "I'm not here to punish anyone," I began, voice calm, unwavering. "But if we're going to move forward as a family, things need to change. Some habits, some patterns, are toxic. They have to stop." I glanced at my brother first, his smirk now replaced with a flicker of unease. "You," I said softly, "need to learn that cruelty doesn't make anyone stronger. It makes them bitter, and it keeps you small. If you want a relationship with me, you'll need to apologize, not just with words, but by proving respect in actions. Start by supporting others, not tearing them down." Dad's face tightened, and I held his gaze firmly. "You've always been silent when it mattered, and your inaction caused more harm than any words could. You can make amends by being present, by listening, by seeing people for who they are, not who you want them to be. That includes me." My mother's lips trembled, and I softened my tone for her. "You've tried to hold us together, but sometimes holding on means enabling behavior that shouldn't be tolerated. You need to find the courage to set boundaries, for yourself and for everyone." I paused, letting the conditions settle in. "I will help where I can, but on my terms. Any assistance, any support comes with accountability. No more dismissals, no more condescension. Everyone here has potential, but potential means nothing without effort, integrity, and respect." I watched their reactions closely. Shame and disbelief mingled with tentative hope. I knew the weight of these expectations would feel heavy, but growth always demanded effort. I wasn't punishing, I was guiding. I wanted them to heal, not just for my sake, but for theirs. Then I leaned back, a subtle smile curling on my lips. "This isn't just about me. It's about all of us. If you're willing to try, to change, to rise above old habits, then maybe we can build something better. But the first step is acknowledging the truth and acting on it. The second step is proving you're capable of more than the roles you've assigned yourselves." I saw the hesitation in their eyes, but I also saw glimpses of understanding, tiny sparks of the realization that life didn't have to repeat old patterns. The control had shifted, yes, but with control came responsibility. I was offering them a chance, not for my sake, but for the chance they had squandered for too long. And in that room, I felt the balance tip fully into my hands. Not vengeance, not triumph for show, just measured, undeniable power paired with compassion. The smirk I remembered from years ago had evaporated, replaced by respect that could only be earned. Weeks passed after that evening, and the changes I had demanded began to take root, unevenly but undeniably. My brother no longer offered sly jabs or smirks. Instead, he listened, asked questions, and even offered to help on projects I had once handled alone. It wasn't perfection, but progress. Dad started showing up, not just in appearances, but in presence, his voice carrying the weight of attention and care. My mother, quiet and thoughtful, began setting boundaries and encouraging others, her strength now emerging in ways I had long hoped for. I watched it all unfold from my apartment, the city lights twinkling like the fragments of my own memories. The silver key, still tucked into the pendant I wore, rested over my heart. It had guided me through doubt, fear, and struggle, and now it served as a symbol of everything I had achieved, not just the wealth or the accolades, but the woman I had become. Independence, yes, but also the wisdom to offer grace where it was deserved and firmness where it was needed. I reflected on the girl who had sat frozen at the Christmas table years ago, the one who had swallowed the sting of humiliation and wrapped it into fuel. She had been brave without knowing it, resilient without realizing the scope of her own strength. And now, watching my family slowly adjust, I realized that strength was not just personal, it had the power to change the dynamics around me, to mend, to teach, to elevate. The silver key glinted in the sunlight as I reached for my morning coffee, the aroma sharp and grounding. It reminded me that every journey begins with a small, often unseen step. That night at Christmas, I had felt powerless, dismissed, and unseen. Today, I was powerful, visible, and in control, not by taking from others, but by shaping my own destiny. And so I smiled, soft and knowing, as I stepped onto my balcony, the city stretching endlessly before me. The lessons were clear, the journey complete, and the woman I had become undeniable. I am the author of my own story, the keeper of my own keys, and no one can decide my place at the table but me.